Eleanor Sue is our next speaker. She also focused on sea level rise and really expressed an interest in sea level rise kind of from the beginning. And it's a reasonable thing for her to be interested in, given her background in education. Up in Northern California, she studied as her major science, but also minored in legal studies, which I think is really awesome. And she worked in science briefly, and then realized that this intersection was much more interesting. And she did her summer project on sea level rise and has had a strong interest in this topic, particularly on the adaptation policy angle right from the beginning. So it's my pleasure to introduce Eleanor Sue for her presentation. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all? All right, thank you. Yes, my name is Eleanor Sue, and today I'll be discussing the challenges of using beach width as a parameter for coastal vulnerability, particularly in the San Diego region. San Diego County is particularly vulnerable to becoming more and more at risk for erosion and sea level rise. And the beaches of San Diego are especially vulnerable due to their decreasing supply of sand. This is because, like the rest of California, a lot of the San Diego coast has been urbanized, and sand that once come from upstream is now accumulating behind urban infrastructure, such as dams. That considered all together these factors, you can see why beaches of San Diego are increasingly at risk for totally disappearing. When we apply beaches to the topic of coastal vulnerability, we can understand that they're key systems in that they protect the coastline from a variety of coastal hazards such as strong winds, storm surges, and flooding. Beaches are not only a place of recreation and commerce, but they also act as the physical buffer by absorbing and dissipating the energy from incoming breaking waves and wind, and help to stabilize our shoreline. This increasing threat to the San Diego coastline has prompted many of the San Diego cities to start updating their current coastal management plans and start creating adaptation plans in preparation for this expected change in the shoreline. Beach width, which refers to the cross-shore measurement from the position of the shoreline to the back end of the beach, is being increasingly cited as a potential parameter for total coastal vulnerability. This is because beach width is a reflection, or can be considered a reflection, of the state of the whole beach, in that the wider the beach, the more space in between the ocean and the inland, and the greater ability of the beach to act as a buffer. There are a few basic terms I want to discuss when establishing a parameter. The first of which is a threshold. It refers to the breaking point or the maximum capacity of a system. Often when a threshold is reached, you can expect a significant change in the performance or quality of the system. When applied to beaches, a threshold could be the minimum beach width observable, and that is to say, if there is little to no beach, there is little to no protection from the coastal hazards. A second term I'm going to introduce is a baseline, which is the starting point of any metric which any change is calculated. Just like the basic heart rate of someone who's wearing a heart thermometer, it kind of measures the base status of the beach without any stressors or alterations to the system. And the last term is an indicator term called a trigger, which you place along the plan of action and serves as a forewarning that the threshold is being close to reached, and prompts the decision to change the current course of action. In the lower right-hand corner, you can see an example that shows you how triggers and thresholds can be placed in terms of sea level rise, where at first the current pathway involves a house that's being protected by sand. When it reaches 0.5 meters in increased sea level rise, that sand is no longer going to effectively protect that house, and it prompts it to change to pathway number 2, which is more of a strong fixed measure such as a seawall, and so on and so forth. In my project, I also explored the potential influence of major external events such as El Nino and beach nourishments on beach width. El Nino is the large-scale oceanic and atmospheric phenomenon characterized by unusually warm surface temperatures in the central and east equatorial Pacific Ocean. This strong, unusual, warm ocean means that more energy from heat and moisture is translated into stronger and more frequent storms during the winter months of an El Nino. These abnormally strong storms influence strong wave action that leads to increased erosion and amounts of sands that is permanently lost to the deep water instead of washing back ashore the following summer. With El Ninos predicted to become more frequent in the future, we can expect the problem of erosion to be exacerbated. The second of which I looked at was beach nourishment, which is the filling of beaches with additional sand in attempt to combat erosion and increase beach width and volume. This is often considered a soft coastal armoring technique in that it is not fixed, unlike a seawall. Beach nourishments tend to be temporary and expensive in that they will eventually erode away, and the nourishment projects themselves can be considered huge engineering projects whereby it can be labor intensive, time intensive, and require specialized equipment, not to mention that beaches have to be closed off, and this halts any commerce or recreation that would happen on the beach otherwise. In terms of local monitoring, the most extensive beach monitoring effort in the San Diego region is conducted by the San Diego Association of Governments, or SANDAG for short. They fund this program and it's conducted by the engineering firm Coastal Frontiers and begin all the way back in 1996. This consists of semi-annual profiling during the spring and fall, and it currently has 54 transects across 39 locations, with each of these transects being 1 to 3 km apart. Transects are simply a measurement of from the shoreline to the back of the beach, a horizontal measurement of the beach. Also, the Scripps Institution of Oceanography has a monitoring program of their own, and scientists have been monitoring at 3 sites, Cardiff, Solana Beach, Imperial Beach, and Torrey Pines, since 2001. These consist of monthly beach surveys where transects are about 100 meters apart instead of previously mentioned 1 to 3 km apart. So the primary aim of this study was to assess the natural variability of beach within San Diego and identify any notable changes and deviations from that norm trend in order to explore what cities can really capture about beach width with the limited monitoring resources. My study looked at 2 sites from the Scripps database, Torrey Pines and Imperial Beach. These were measured over 8 years with monthly measurements at mean sea level. The first location is Imperial Beach, which is located on the western side of the city of Imperial Beach and is managed by the city. This study site was about 4.2 km in length with 42 transects. This beach was last nourished in 2012, and for the purposes of this study will be referred to as our Nourished Beach. And the city of Imperial Beach did publish a sea level rise assessment in 2016 that did cite beach profiles as a key way of understanding local variability in the sand supply, sediment transport, and erosion. The second site is North Torrey Pines, which is the northern section of the Torrey Pines State Beach and is located just west of the Torrey Pines Natural State Reserve and the Los Penasquitos Lagoon. This site was about 2.8 kilometers in length with 28 transects. And last year, the Los Penasquitos Lagoon Foundation was awarded funding to grant for the Torrey Pines State Beach Sea Level Rise Plan Adaptation Planning Project, in that although they did not cite beach width specifically, they did mention outlining opportunities and constraints to construct innovative natural shoreline and infrastructure to increase protection. So my methods were centered around evaluating ways of natural variability of beach width, and it was accomplished through statistical analysis of a time series put through programs such as Excel by Microsoft and MATLAB by MathWorks. Here, I analyzed these data sets on a multi-year, annual, and seasonal timescale, as well as did some subsampling to the raw data set to kind of mimic the limited resources that SANDAG has. as a proxy for what limited resources the cities will have in the future in terms of beach monitoring. In this first illustration, I charted beach drift by subtracting the time average beach drift from each individual transect. And you can tell by the changes in color from year to year that Torrey Pines has a more stable cycle, whereas Imperial Beach shows a bit more fluctuation, which could be attributed to the 2012 Nourishment, but it's apparent even before that. And we can also see that North Torrey Pines has a prevalence of more overall cool colors, indicating there could be a decreasing trend in beach drift, whereas Imperial Beach shows the opposite with more prevalence of more warm colors, and is suggested because of the nourishment we received in 2012. This is a mean plot of all the beach drift for each of the sites. This was calculated as the mean over all transects for each date of measurement. Here you can see there's a pretty clear cycle of highs during the late summer and early fall and lows during the early spring. There's also a sharp increase and decreases that are notable. The sharp decreases between 2009 and 2010, as well as 2015 to 2016, can be attributed to the El Ninos that happened during those periods, as well as that large increase in Imperial Beach's plot that would reflect the nourishment received during that time period as well. I wanted to also explore the seasonal cycle of what a beach might look like on an annual basis. This seasonal cycle was calculated by finding the month averages for all of the years, aka all the month for all of the January measurements, February measurements, and as seen from the previous slide. In both sites, you can clearly see that there is a low during the early spring, late winter during February and March for Imperial Beach and North Torrey Pines, as well as the highest month being October for both sites. These can be attributed to the huge winter wave season where the beach experiences a lot of erosion just after winter and takes its time to recover during the summer. Lastly, this plot shows the difference between a natural and nourished site, in that Imperial Beach being our nourished site and Torrey Pines being our natural site. And I plotted this to see whether does one weigh out the other, and really does a nourishment, can it offset the effects of an El Nino? And it does so in that you see that it does mimic Imperial Beach more so than it does North Torrey Pines, which reaffirms that nourishments do have the potential to offset the huge eroding effect of El Ninos. And lastly, we come to our subsampling illustrations, where taking the recommendations and from the Sandike report, we used the every 10th measurement. Since every measurement from the Scripps data was of a transect 100 meters apart, every 10th measurement would be a 1 kilometer sampling that very mimics what Sandike has right now when they do their monitoring. And from then, we placed all of the spring values and the fall values to be in line with their spring and fall monitoring practices. From that, we subtracted those spring values to get any abnormalities, and we plotted that against the annual plots to see which of the two seasonal plots might better mimic the annual plots. And we can see from here that spring does mimic the annual plot a bit better in both sites than the fall. So with all that said, my recommendations for cities, if they do have a limited number of resources to just one single measurement per year, it would be to do a single survey for a beach spring profile right after the winter months. And a baseline could be 2 consecutive years of spring profiles, with triggers possibly being measurements repeatedly below that spring profile for 5 consecutive years to show a clear decreasing trend. And if possible, we could start the spring profile right after an El Nino, and that El Nino really has the potential to reset the whole equilibrium of the beach after so much has been eroded away. This study was largely limited by the amount of data and the variance of the data, in that I only looked at 8 years from 2 sites, and not all of the beaches in the San Diego region are the same with the same amounts of measurements and physical features included in the sites. As well, it's biased by the methods of analysis. I only used statistical analysis. I didn't go more into depth into trends or regressions that much. And other variable factors such as the grain size of nourishments or the physical features of the sites, such as offshore reefs and cliffs, I did not include in this study, which all could have an effect on beach drift itself. What are my key takeaways? Beach drift has the potential to be a pretty effective parameter for coastal vulnerability in that it can be a reflection of how well a beach is or is not doing. And beach drift at these sites do have a fairly predictable seasonal annual cycle, with both sites having lows in the winter and highs in the late summer and early fall. I also saw that major external events such as El Nino and beach nourishment do have the potential to reset the whole equilibrium of the beaches. And these need to be taken into account when setting triggers and baselines, because if the beaches reset more often, you have to take into account resetting your baseline as well as the triggers you place along them. And lastly, even with just a single one-year survey, cities could get a reasonable understanding of their beaches with beach drift variability. And early spring seems to be the most suited time for monitoring, as it, like I said before, beaches have just gone through their highest season of erosion, and that's where it's a good start to measure how much they can gain and maintain over the years. And it's important that monitoring be continuous and regular for a reliable prediction and forecast. With the more measurements included, the more true representation of the site. And thank you for listening, and a special acknowledgement to my capstone committee, Laura Ingeman from the Center of Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation, Dr. Mark Merrifield of Scritch Institution of Oceanography, and Bonnie Lotka from Scritch Institution of Oceanography. Thank you.
Great job, Eleanor. That was wonderful. Awesome. We have about 2 minutes for Q&A. Our first question comes in from Larry, who asks, Torrey Pines Beach uses heavy equipment each year to clear sand barriers that prevent the Penasquitos Lagoon from draining water and sediment. This is not considered nourishment. Is that correct?
No, this is not considered nourishment, in that nourishment usually means additional sand from an outside source. It did receive nourishment way back in the beginning of 2001, but since then it has not. That's mostly the shifting of existing sand that has been on the beach. So no, it's not considered any nourishment.
Excellent, thank you. Our next question is from Nicholas, who says, great presentation and thank you. What would your recommendation be for a data limited, not close to a great place like Scripps, city in terms of beach width monitoring for information triggers and thresholds for coastal vulnerability?
Like I mentioned before, it seems that spring seems to be an ideal time of year if you just want to make that one single survey, and that it's right after when the beach has been largely eroded upon. And it's kind of like the starting point to see how much sand it gains back during the year, and if it does. As well as triggers could be quantitative measures, such as maybe 50% of what the highest point during that year. If the highest beach drift that year was 20 meters, and for some reason the next 2 summers it's at 15 meters or 10 meters, that could be considered a trigger. Or it could be a time measurement trigger, such as no gain over 5 consecutive years of measuring during spring. It really depends on how cautious you are as coastal managers and how you want to set these, as well as the resources available to you guys. So like I said before, parameters are all based largely upon your current understanding, the information available, as well as how cautious you want to be when you plan these triggers and thresholds.
Wonderful, thank you. And with that, we are out of time for any other questions, but Jack, we see your question and we'll reach out to you afterwards so Eleanor can follow up. Thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to Corey if you have anything to add before we head out on break.